So good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Bob Horenstein, and I am the Director of Community Relations and Public Affairs for the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. Tonight's forum is sponsored by the Federation's Jewish Community Relations Council, which is chaired by Michelle Bombet-Minch. So if you're not familiar with the work of the JCRC, which is our Jewish Community Relations Council, let me just tell you a few things about the type of work that we do, which often is in an interfaith context. We try to help safeguard the social safety net. We address homelessness. We combat anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. We try to raise awareness about the serious threat of climate change, and we try to strengthen local ties to the state of Israel. Now, as a 501c3, the Jewish Federation is nonpartisan and cannot endorse political candidates, but obviously all of you realize that we do hold candidate forums so that you can hear directly from the candidates about the issues of importance, not just to the Jewish community, but also to the greater community as well. Now, we're hoping to have two more forums coming up here in the month of April. One of them, a tentative date, so just kind of pencil it in your calendars. The evening of April 18th, we hope to hear from the Republican candidates for governor. And then on April 21st, a noontime conversation with Betsy Johnson, who is running as an independent in this race. So a couple of just logistical things. The chat function will be disabled. And if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. Now, we only have a short time with these candidates, and we've had some questions already given to us in advance. So we will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we probably won't get to all of them. So just be aware of that. So again, use the Q&A function, not the chat function, which will be disabled. Tonight's forum is moderated by Hank Kaplan. Hank is a board member of the Jewish Federation. He is also the vice chair of our Jewish Community Relations Council. And if that's not enough, he's also the chair of our Legislative Advocacy Committee, which was very involved in planning tonight's forum. So with that, I will hand it over to Hank.
Thank you, Bob. And welcome everyone to our Democratic Gubernatorial Candidate Forum. The governorship is easily the most important of our four statewide elected offices in Oregon, the other three, of course, being the state treasurer, secretary of state, and state labor commissioner. Over the past 30 years, we've had four Democratic governors, Kate Brown, Don Kitzhaber, Ted Kulongoski, and Barbara Roberts, each of which came to office with extensive prior experience in the legislature. The two candidates we are visiting with today both have similar extensive experience in the Oregon legislature. Some of you may have asked why we haven't invited the entire field of Democratic candidates. Our committee thought that such a forum would be unwieldy and ultimately not helpful. Our goal is to spend some quality time with each candidate. The Jewish Federation is, of course, nonpartisan. We do not endorse any candidates for office. We selected our guests tonight based on poll numbers and our own rather unscientific Community Relations Council poll of who we would be most interested in hearing from. Our format tonight will be to spend 45 minutes with each candidate. Each will speak for a little while, and then we will have the opportunity to ask questions. If you have questions that you would like us to have us ask the candidates, please put them in the Q&A, but please understand that given the short span of time that we don't expect to get to everyone's questions. Because of the format of this webcast, the chat function is disabled. So we will start with Oregon Treasurer Tobias Reed, who will visit with us until about 7:45, at which point Treasurer Reed will leave us and we will visit with former Speaker of the House, Tina Kotek. So please join me in welcoming Tobias Reed. He is the current Oregon State Treasurer. Mr. Reed was a member of the Oregon House of Representatives, representing District 27 from 2007 to 2017, which comprises parts of Beaverton, Southwest Portland, and unincorporated Multnomah and Washington counties. He served as Speaker pro tem and was formerly the Democratic Majority Whip. In 2016, he ran for Oregon State Treasurer to succeed Ted Wheeler. He became the State Treasurer in January 2017 and was reelected in 2020. So welcome, Treasurer Reed, and thank you again for joining us this evening. The floor is yours. For the next 10 minutes at least, to share with us whatever you feel we should know about you, your candidacy, your positions, and especially your priorities and the goals that you have for your term as governor should you win. All the participants will be muted, but while Mr. Reed is speaking, please go ahead and use the Q&A function on the bottom left of your screen to ask questions. And at the end of Treasurer Reed's introductory remarks, we will ask him as many questions as we can get to in the time allotted. So for the next 10 minutes, please tell us what are the primary things that you hope to accomplish as governor? And second, how do you hope to deal with the toxic divisions, not just Republican, Democrat, but also rural, urban, that seem to be constraining the effective governance of our state?
Thank you, Hank, and thanks to all of you for the chance to spend some time with you. Of course, I'm looking forward to when we can do this in person, but in the meantime, I'm glad to have some time with all of you, and I'm looking forward very much to the dialogue as well. Happy to share some thoughts as stimulus for the conversation, but I know that the dialogue is going to be better for me. I gotta say, I think there's some heavy times that are in front of us in Oregon right now. And I assume you probably agree. For me, it's easy to see. You just drive around Portland and you can pretty easily see evidence of our situation with homelessness. Watch the news or read headlines. You can very quickly see news of another shooting. And I think every parent I know is on edge to some degree, worried about whether their kid is going to be sent home from school because of a COVID outbreak. I think all of us these days have to find some way of getting a break from the intensity of life. And for me, over the last several months, it has been the chance to help coach our daughter's 7th grade basketball team. It was a welcome respite for a few hours every week when I could put aside all the craziness and just focus on this team and this sport. And I have really loved watching them come together. Seeing a team form was a really welcome thing. And I always left those practices and those games, whether or not we got the results we wanted, feeling a little bit more grounded and a little bit more committed, resolved really to try to make Oregon a better place. And that is why I'm running for governor. I'm frustrated with where our state is today. And I think even in this primary election, we have a really clear choice. We can choose more of the same, the status quo, or we can choose a new direction. And I think we need a new direction, a new change in Oregon. It's clear to me that we can't afford the status quo and more of what's happening in Salem, because what we're doing today is not working. We've been talking about homelessness for years in Oregon. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and yet the crisis seems only to be getting worse. Some people seem content to wait years until more permanent affordable housing is built, but that's going to take years, and we don't have years to wait. We should be clear too, this is not just a Portland problem. I hear from mayors all across the state about what they need right now, which is funding to build emergency shelters, to get people off the street and into safe, clean, transitional housing. So let's get people to mental health care and the addiction services they need, and let's stop making excuses. There's nothing compassionate about letting our neighbors continue to live on the street in unsafe and unsanitary conditions. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to families who can't use their local parks or feel safe in their neighborhood. I think a lot about the small businesses around the state who are suffering too. There's one woman I met with a while ago whose story feels pretty typical. A woman named Christina owns a chocolate shop in downtown Portland. And her experience really is common because she cares about her neighbors. She wants to help people who are experiencing homelessness. She's gotten to know some of the folks around her business, but she's also been accosted on her way to work repeatedly. She's seen violent confrontations. Her customers don't feel safe, and neither do her employees. So we've got to be committed to doing right by her and by the people who are in need. I'm also really concerned that we're not seeing the urgency we should when it comes to gun violence. It seems like every week brings another headline and another family torn apart. And these numbers are just absolutely shocking. We think about Portland having the most violent year it ever had in 2021. More shootings than bigger cities like Boston, San Francisco, and twice the number that we're seeing in Seattle. So we need a much more proactive, robust response. I think we should ban ghost guns, the untraceable firearms that are an increasing part of the problem. I think we should ban high capacity magazines to help prevent mass shootings. I would lead a statewide gun buyback program to help get firearms out of circulation. And yes, we need more law enforcement on our streets who are trained to go after gun crime and illegal gun dealers. Finally, as a parent of two public school students, I see up close what's happening in our schools. Every time a school closes, kids fall farther behind. They learn less, their mental health suffers, and their parents are often forced into a terrible situation, having to choose between caring for their kid or keeping their paycheck. That's a burden that falls most heavily and most often on low-income families and children of color. But closing a school should be an absolute last resort. And this too can't just be a local issue. We need a state response that helps put the resources into place for summer school to help kids who need to catch up, and provides hazard pay for teachers and staff who continue to do absolutely essential work. So high quality schools, safe and clean streets, affordable housing. These are all really important parts of our future success. But this is what also motivates me. As I look across the state, I see a whole lot more that we need to be doing. As treasurer, I've been focused on growing the economy and protecting our retirement. That's why we've helped more than 100,000 Oregonians save over $150 million for their retirement. That's why we've cut Wall Street fees on our investments to the tune of $500 million and counting. It's why we've doubled our investments in renewable energy and clean technology, and used our status as a major shareholder to push companies like ExxonMobil away from fossil fuels and to reduce their carbon emissions. We're also on the verge of finalizing a major agreement that will create the North America's largest research forest in the Elliott State Research Forest. And in the legislature, I was really proud to be a leader in bringing full-day kindergarten to Oregon and creating a rainy day fund that helps us navigate economic disruptions. In fact, all of this is unified, I think, by the fact that I always focus my work on the investments we're making in our future, because what we do right now is going to determine our success decades from now. We can make Oregon a leader in clean energy. We're on our way to 100% clean energy by 2040, but to make that a reality, we have to match our good intentions with execution. We have to embrace offshore wind. We have to build out charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and we have to make our buildings, homes and offices alike, a lot more energy efficient. Our success, our progress in the battle against climate change depends on us moving quickly here. We can have a workforce that's prepared for the jobs of tomorrow, but we have to start by investing in our kids now. It means creating a baby bond program for every Oregonian at birth so that they have a nest egg waiting for them when they're ready to pay for college or job training. Universal pre-K for every kid so they get a strong start on their learning. Rising literacy and graduation rates, better connections between community colleges and local employers so we can create training programs that lead to good jobs. And we can build an economy that doesn't leave people behind. I think there are too many people in Oregon right now, especially in rural communities, who've concluded that there aren't any opportunities left for them where they were raised. So we need a comprehensive regional strategy to support entrepreneurship and bring high-speed internet to every corner of the state. We've got to invest in local strengths, whether that's precision agriculture or mass timber or offshore wind and seafood processing. Here's the bottom line. I am not satisfied with where we are in Oregon today, and I hope you aren't either. I'm not willing to sit back and watch as homelessness grows and crime spreads and our kids fall farther behind. We've got to bring a sense of urgency to state government and insist on the real solutions that we need to these challenges that we face. That, I think, is how we rebuild confidence in ourselves, in state governments, how we unleash the imagination and ambition that have been lacking, in my view, of late. And it's how we invest for a brighter future for our kids and for ourselves. That's, I think, also how we unify the state in all its wonderful diversity. So I hope this is helpful in the conversation that we're going to have tonight. I really appreciate the chance to be with you. I'm definitely looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Treasurer Reed. Well, you started off with homelessness, and we've got quite a few questions already in the chat about that topic. So let me ask a few and tell us what you can about your position. Well, what is your position regarding specific steps that the state can take to encourage the development of more housing supplies at all levels? And related to that, do you feel that the statewide rent control law is helpful in dealing with the housing shortage, or does that inhibit it? And also, are there parts of our land use policies, such as local inclusionary zoning rules, that could be changed to accommodate the production of more housing?
Yeah, lots of questions, or lots of aspects to those questions. So let me start broadly. I think we fundamentally need to treat this question with the urgency that it deserves, because we don't have to look far to see the really direct impacts that it's having on people who are experiencing homelessness and people who are observing it or being impacted by it, even as they go through their daily lives. I think it's an all of the above strategy. Frankly, what we need is homelessness for housing for every person who is experiencing homelessness, and we need to get there as quickly as we possibly can. It's a matter of speeding up everything from acquiring vacant motels and converting vacant office space. It's a matter of building more safe rest villages, as Multnomah County and Portland are exploring now. The urgent priority is to get people off the streets and into those safe, clean environments as quickly as they can, where they can also access the services that they need. In the long run, I think we have to be clear about how we can get faster and more efficient at building permanent housing. That includes the questions around zoning. It includes the processes that make that construction slower and more expensive than it needs to be. We've got a shortfall, a gap, and at the present time, we're not doing a very good job of closing that gap. So it's not a time for red tape. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this, and we're not getting the results we need. And that worries me, because we risk losing confidence and support of voters who have historically been willing to finance these investments. We've also got to make sure, as I kind of alluded to before, that we're urgent about another important aspect of this question, which is putting money into rebuilding our mental health care system, getting more resources into treatment options for drug and alcohol dependency. Hank, you also mentioned, or you asked about rent control, and I don't think that is a complete or really a very viable solution, because the research is pretty clear. Rent control does protect some from some adverse outcomes, dramatic rent increases, but it doesn't do anything to address the more fundamental question of why rent is rising, which is really a basic question of supply and demand. I think rent control is limited in its effect to determining who is left out in the cold, and it has an added disadvantage, which is it can limit the production of new housing. I think we should be building more housing of all types, as one of the questions put it, and figuring out how we can offer the most effective subsidies to get that housing built, and to make sure that it is accessible and affordable to low-income families who can't otherwise afford the kind of housing that they need and deserve.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next topic, which concerns anti-Semitism. Oregon, unfortunately, has a rich history of racism and anti-Semitism. Recent data shows that Jews are consistently the most targeted religious community in the United States, and anti-Semitic incidents are being reported at record levels. For example, in 2020, the Anti-Defamation League tabulated over 2,000 reported anti-Semitic incidents throughout the country, which is the third highest year on record since they began tracking these incidents in 1979. Jewish institutions are obviously vulnerable targets. Our Portland community has made enormous investments in institutional security in the past few years, investments that seem essential considering the recent history of attacks on houses of worship. In 2020, reported anti-Semitic incidents at Jewish institutions saw an increase of 40% from 2019. So my questions are, how will you counter terrorism directed against religious minorities? And what safeguards will you advocate to combat hate directed towards marginalized groups? And what steps would you take as an ally to be an ally and partner of the Jewish community around security issues?
Well, I'm really I don't know whether to say shocked or disappointed or some of both at these numbers. Both the raw number and the fact that it is the highest, the third highest, as you said, since 1979. It's terrifying, and I'm not going to forget those numbers. I think the most important thing for me as governor will be a commitment to work directly with the Jewish community, with city government, with law enforcement, and certainly the federal government to combat that terrorism, especially the terrorism that's directed against religious minorities in the state. We've got to assure that the Attorney General and the Department of Justice have the support and the resources they need to prosecute hate crimes and political violence. And I want to reiterate to some extent, it'll sound repetitive, that I think working with the Jewish community to assist in security measures is going to be essential. So we're all staying really well informed on what are the current security concerns. We've got to develop strong partnerships and trusting relationships with local law enforcement on what preventative measures we can take to keep the Jewish community safe. And I think we have to, all of us, be proactive and appropriately aggressive about confronting hate speech and intolerance at its earliest stages, and not wait for it to escalate into action. I think that's one of the lessons that we can learn from recent years, that if people don't get the clear indication that it is not acceptable, that we do not tolerate those kinds of actions, then we can run the risk of it being more normalized and more accepted. So I think a strong partnership is key here, and a steadfast commitment, which I'm happy to have and look forward to working with you on.
Thank you. Treasurer Reed, I'd like to ask you a question that concerns Israel. Our community is very interested in cultivating a strong relationship with Israel. Do you believe that Oregon could benefit from collaboration with the state of Israel in areas such as water, agriculture, high-tech, biotech, and cybersecurity? And if so, what would you do as governor to encourage a formalized partnership with Israel in these areas?
Absolutely, we can. And in fact, I've read 2 books on this that have really affected my thinking. I suspect many people that are with us tonight have read both of these books too. One is Startup Nation. The other one is Let There Be Water, Seth Siegel. I've forgotten the author of the Startup Nation, but both of them were really, I think, powerful for me. And it was the Israeli consul who gave me the Let There Be Water book. I cannot claim to have found it on my own. But both of these books, I think, really tell the story of the commitment that Israel has shown and the benefits that it has realized from a commitment to innovation and a connection between that innovation and really significant and real challenges that are certainly upfront for Israel, but are common in a lot of other places. You mentioned many of them. And sometimes, we joke in politics that R&D stands for rob and duplicate. I don't think there's any shame in that in this case. And so we need to learn from what Israel has done. It's an integrated global economy that we are all part of. And we're certainly becoming more interconnected over geographic boundaries. And I think it's clear that if we are to overcome the challenges that are in front of us, we're going to need more of that collaboration, a greater willingness to learn from people and countries and cultures that face different challenges, but unique versions of it. An approach that might be created by one set of circumstances can absolutely be relevant in another. So I would be really eager to figure out ways to do that. And I feel like I've gotten a decent start on that based on the conversations I've had, some of the limited reading I've done, and the exposure I've had as a result of being treasurer, because of course we do invest a large and globally diversified portfolio. So I think there's great opportunity there, and I'm excited about exploring it with you.
Thank you. Let's switch to talking about climate. We've got a lot of questions in the chat about this topic. Let's start with recent history. After the cap and trade efforts failed in the Senate a couple of years ago, Governor Brown issued the Oregon Climate Action Plan, which set a new greenhouse gas reduction target and directed state agencies to incorporate climate protections into their agency planning and programs. Since then, there's been opposition from within the business sector. Do you support Governor Brown's Oregon Climate Change Action Plan? And if not, why not? And what specifically would you change?
I think the Climate Action Plan is a good step towards addressing the climate crisis, and I'm absolutely in support of its goals. I think there are ways to continue that progress in ways that hopefully build common understanding and goodwill. Part of the job, I think, of governor is different from being a legislator. It's not, as we've talked about already, merely about passing laws or appropriating money, but about doing the hard work of implementation and execution that has to follow legislation. And that's something that I'd be committed to as governor. If we see areas for improvement, either in policy design or in execution, in ways to improve relationships, I think that's something that we should be open to, because we're all in this, and it's a successful response to the climate catastrophe is going to require contributions from everyone. And I think we can do more of that by focusing not just on the bad things we're trying to avoid, but on the opportunities that we're trying to seize. It may look different than business as usual. In this case, I actually mean business, but businesses and entrepreneurs are resilient. They can often be the most creative in figuring out how to solve problems. And I think there's a desperate need for more private and public sector collaboration and cooperation.
So a related question on the topic of climate change is, how would you decide between protecting the climate and protecting jobs when decisions impact both the environment and labor groups?
Well, I think we have to be clear that we want a climate transition that is based on a green economy that provides good jobs that can support families and lift up people who are working. That will include various mechanisms of transition, certainly, that might be things like new training opportunities, or working with labor and industry leaders to map out that transition plan, and short or medium term kind of financial support for people who are impacted by that transition. But in the long run, not only do I think we not have a real choice on protecting the climate, because it is so central to our very existence, but I think there are big opportunities for us to make life and our economic situation better. Our resilience, the opportunities, the quality of life can all be improved if we are smart about taking on the climate in a way that recognizes that. So I'm gently pushing back to say, in the long run, I don't think there is a trade-off here. If we do it right, we can improve the environment and our economic situation.
Thank you. Another question, and this has been commented on in the chat a bit as well. It's about House Bill 4115. This is one of the bills in the short session that the Jewish community supported, the so-called Treasury Transparency Bill that would report on climate-related financial risk to assets held in investment funds. It had majority support in the House, but it apparently was opposed by the Treasury Department. And while you didn't have a vote, did you or would you have supported this bill as it was written? And if not, what are the concerns with the bill, and why shouldn't the Treasury provide this information to the public, insofar as it only involved reporting on investments?
I have good news for you, Hank. We have provided that information, and we will. We run a large portfolio, as we've talked about already, $140 billion. And I appreciated the conversation that we'd been involved in for months leading up to the session about how we can provide that information. We have to do that in a way that protects the arrangements we have with fund managers. But our team at Treasury worked creatively and diligently to figure out a way to do that in a way that was not contrary to our contract agreements. And we did so. And I said very publicly at the Investment Council meeting before or during the legislative session, time is flying, and I can't remember exactly the date that we did this, that I really appreciated the work that the Treasury team did to get to this place, and that I expected that this was the new norm for us going forward. So that information is public and will continue to be public.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the social safety net.
Sure.
Social research has found that social determinants of health include stable housing, access to food, access to healthcare, and assistance in navigating the healthcare system. But sadly, many low-income and particularly minorities and people of color are impacted by the absence of these determinants and have higher levels of illness and mortality as a result. What strategies would you undertake if you were governor to improve those outcomes?
This is one of the advantages, I think, for me of having served as the state's chief investment officer, because I think the point that you're making in this question is that investments in the social safety net and social determinants of health really are investments. They'll pay off later with lesser costs, with lesser need for interventions. So that's going to be a theme that runs through all of my decisions and all of my budgets. I think we should measure ourselves as a state based on the well-being of our kids and their future prospects. So I think we've got to make those early investments that change outcomes for kids on the long run. The earlier we can make those in a kid's life, the better outcomes we're going to see in later life. We need more housing of all kinds. We talked about that. We need to actually implement a paid family leave program. You'll probably hear about our passage of this program in 2019, and that's great. But we need to make sure it's actually helping people. We've seen it delayed time and again, and it's not helping people yet. We need to make investments in good, accessible, affordable childcare, in healthcare for kids. And we've got to make sure that every kid has access to pre-K to give them a strong start on learning. I think all of these things can be part of a dashboard that allows us to measure the progress of kids' well-being in Oregon. And that's a great connection to the social determinants you described.
So let's turn to the issue of substance abuse, which is, I guess, related. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health conducted by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services shows that Oregon now ranks second in the country for substance abuse disorder, with 18% of the population suffering from an addiction to alcohol and or drugs. And at the same time, Oregon has fallen to 50th in access to treatment for that 18% of Oregonians who need it. What do you envision as Oregon's strategic plan to end our addiction crisis?
Well, this seems like a pretty bad combination, doesn't it? To have second on disorder and 50th in access to treatment. It would be great if we could reverse those numbers. And I think the way to get on that path is by making investments in building out our capacity. We've lost a lot of beds through the pandemic, and we've got to get back to that. We've also got to make it easier to see where there is capacity throughout the state, a centralized system to track where there are open beds. A person may not be ready to access that treatment on the same 9 to 5 schedule that we might like. So making it easy for people to find the capacity when they need it. We've got to be intentional about where that capacity exists. People have these issues throughout the state, and capacity should exist throughout the state as well. And I think there is also an untapped opportunity, or at least we've gotten away from doing the work early on with youth and teens in schools to equip them with the ability to try to resist those temptations. I think all of these elements and more have to be part of our strategic plan.
Thank you. You made some initial remarks about gun violence, and we've got some questions about that. Let's start with the initiative petitions that are circulating on the topic of gun violence. One of them, IP-17, involves a permit requirement to purchase a firearm, combined with restrictions on the types of ammunition and large magazines, which I think you indicated that you support. Another, IP-18, restricts the manufacture and sale of all semi-automatic assault weapons. Do you support both of those measures, or or perhaps other measures to curb the spread of gun violence in our state?
I do. And I'm the only candidate in this race who has actually outlined a specific gun violence platform, and you can find that on our website. I mentioned some of these before. I think we need to ban ghost guns. I think we need to ensure that that law enforcement has the resources and the expertise to combat gun violence. And I think we have a lot of potential in partnering with local organizations who are doing violence prevention work in communities across the state.
So one of the things that I think I mentioned in my opening remarks was the divisions in our state. And we have a question in the chat about the rural-urban divide that has become very antagonistic in our state. How would you address that?
I have one unfair advantage that I'll start with, which is that I was raised in Idaho. So I'm comfortable talking about that and showing up in places that maybe are not common. And I think that goes a long way to actually show up and with some humility to ask people what they perceive as what they're worried about, what their opportunities are, and not in a way that shows people up or is there in a way to tell people how to live. And I think when you do that, you're focused on the common aspirations, so some great things can happen. I mentioned the Elliott State Research Forest, and I have to use that as an example too, because this is a problem that has been sort of percolating along in Oregon since the 90s. And in the land board, we decided we're gonna try to take this on. And in doing so, we called together a pretty extraordinary group of Oregonians to serve as an advisory group. And we kept pushing them metaphorically back on the bus when things would kind of fall apart. We'd say, no, remember the goal here. We got to stick together. And, they signed up for 1 year. We're now in the third year. So something's going right in terms of their commitment. And I'll never forget an image, an experience I watched right before the pandemic took over. So we were in the land board room and a number of people were sitting in front of us, two of whom I remember particularly, Paul Beck, who represents the Douglas Timber Operators, and Bob Salinger, who represents the Portland Audubon Society. Probably would be hard pressed to find two guys who were farther apart politically. And they were sitting next to each other, describing the framework that they had come up with. And I don't remember whether it was Bob or Paul who said this, but he was pointing at the other person and said, when we started this, I didn't like him. And I still don't agree with very much of what he said. But we have to continue this, because not only have we constructed something that could work, not something that any one of us would have designed if we got to do it ourselves, but it can work. And maybe more importantly, it's a model for how we can take on other big challenges in Oregon. This involved urban folks, it involved rural folks, it involved conservation folks, it involved timber and logging folks, it involved just about every sort of group you could imagine. And it was big philosophical issues. It was small, detailed implementation issues, but with diligence, with persistence, with commitment, and with flexibility, we've gotten to a place that I think we can all be really proud of. That's the sort of approach that I would bring to these questions. It's showing up and staying in it after the headline has existed. We shouldn't make the mistake of trying to govern just by a headline. We've got to stay in it, and then we get some great outcomes.
So another question in the chat concerns campaign contributions. Oregon is one of the few states that has reporting requirements, but no actual limits on campaign contributions. Do you support limits on campaign contributions? And if so, what would those limits look like?
I would be fine with contribution limits. I supported the constitutional change. But I have to tell you about an experience I had many years ago when I ran a legislative campaign during the one cycle in Oregon where we had contribution and expenditure limits. Again, I'm not saying this as a critique of them, but just a reminder that limits on their own are not the panacea we might wish them to be. So in this campaign, when contribution and expenditure limits were in effect, one of the first things I did every day was go to the post office and search through the recycling bins. And you might wonder why I would do that. But the reason is that gave me a 1 day or maybe a 2 day head start or preview on what people would be getting at home in their mailboxes, because the people would get them in their PO boxes, would take them out and put them in the recycling bins. So it is not that contribution limits change the nature of the speech that's in a campaign necessarily. It just changes who is saying it. So there were a lot of independent expenditures that were saying things about our campaign, and because we were complying with the law, we didn't know what they were saying until it was public. So I'm fine with the limits, but I think it needs to be accompanied with mechanisms to improve transparency. So as those independent expenditures are making their statements and communicating with voters, voters would also have the opportunity to evaluate the source of those communications.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I certainly want to give you an opportunity to brag. So why don't you tell us what you think are some of the most successful or best accomplishments that you've done as state treasurer or in your government service generally, and not only as state treasurer, but while you're in the legislature?
Well, I think I appreciate the opportunity. I think I might even take that definition a little bit further afield and try to rectify something that I maybe should have done at the start, which is to say that the thing I am probably most proud of as being a husband to a wonderful woman that I've been married to since 2007, and we are parents of a 12-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. That and the fact that they still tolerate me putting up with my public service for these years is probably the biggest accomplishment. As far as substance, I'd put a few things on my list. I don't remember if we talked too much about Oregon Saves, but this is a really important thing that we did in Oregon, first state in the country to recognize the challenge of a lack of retirement savings in Oregon. So we passed a bill and implemented a law that requires employers to facilitate a retirement savings plan if they don't offer one of their own. So 5 years in, we have 115,000 people who have funded IRAs and have saved $150 million and counting. That's making a real difference in people's lives. And no one had done that before. It was, again, that diligence, that execution that made it happen. We've remade our college savings plan so that it's not just for wealthy white people in metro areas. It works for people in every income level all around Oregon. And we are committed to making sure that every kid has access to a college savings plan, because when they do, no matter how much is in it, they're 3 times as likely to go to college and 4 times as likely to graduate from college. Helping to bring full-day kindergarten to Oregon. It's sort of a norm now, I think, kind of expected, and that's great, but it wasn't always that case. In fact, we had to overcome some opposition to the idea of full-day kindergarten, but it's clear to me that investing in kids is about the best investment we can make. And I want Oregon to be committed to that and really clear about the connection between the decisions we make on behalf of our kids now and what we're going to see in the future. So that, I think, is really what I would close with and suggest that we've got a real choice in this election. It's 7 weeks from tonight, 49 days or 48 days, if we consider this day finished. We'll be thinking about who the nominee is heading into the general election. And I think it matters to have someone with executive service and someone who has twice won statewide office.
Well, I see that Speaker Kotek has signed on, former Speaker Kotek has signed on, and we have many more questions, but we do have to move on to save some time.
I'd be glad to follow up with anyone offline. My email is easy, so please encourage people to be in touch.
And I know everyone joins me in thanking you for taking the time to chat with us, and we thank you as well as Tina Kotek for your dedication to public service on behalf of our state and our communities. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. Wish you luck.
Thank you for the commitment and the very serious and thoughtful questions. I appreciate it.
And hopefully you'll be willing to chat with us again in the not too distant future. Maybe
of course. I'd be thrilled.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Before we get to former speaker, I know there were some folks that signed on late. And so I just want to reiterate that we are efforting to have a forum with the Republican candidates, at least some of them. And tentatively, that'll be on the evening of April 18th at 7 p.m. And also, we have at least a tentative date. We think it's a pretty good bet that on April 21st, that's a Thursday at noon, we will have a conversation with former Senator Betsy Johnson, who is running as an independent. So please save those dates, and we will be getting an announcement out to you shortly about those forums. Hank, back to you.
Speaker, former Speaker Kotek, can we? You can unmute yourself and come online. And thank you for your patience. I'm Hank Kaplan. I'm the chair of the Legislative Committee for the Jewish Community Relations Council, and we've quite a number of people in the audience for this session, and we hope to get to know you a bit through this webinar. But first, let me tell the audience a little bit about you. Prior to her public service, Tina Kotek was public policy advocate for the Oregon Food Bank and then worked as the policy director for Children First for Oregon. She co-chaired the Human Services Coalition of Oregon during the 2002 budget crisis and served as the co-chair of the Governor's Medicaid Advisory Committee. In 2006, she won a three-way Democratic primary for Oregon House District 44, which includes parts of North and Northeast Portland. In the general election, she defeated her opponent with nearly 80% of the vote and has been reelected every 2 years since then. She rose in the House leadership, serving as the Democratic whip in 2009, and has been Speaker or co-Speaker of the House continuously since 2011 until 2 months ago, when she resigned from the House to focus on her campaign. So welcome, former Speaker Kotek, and thank you again for joining us this evening. Again, the participants are muted, but the participants can use the Q&A function to ask any questions which I have on the screen. And at the end of your initial remarks, we will ask as many questions as we can get through in the time allotted. So the floor is yours to talk about your priorities for up to 10 minutes. Please tell us, what are the primary things that you hope to accomplish as governor? And how do you hope to deal with the toxic divisions, not just Democratic, Republican, but rural, urban, that seem to be dividing the state and hindering our effective governance?
Well, thank you, Hank, and good evening, everyone. I'll start off telling you a little bit why I'm running for governor, then and get into those top priorities and a little bit about, what we need to do to bring our state together. So first of all, I just want to thank you all again for being here tonight, and thank you to the Jewish Community Relations Council for organizing this forum. It's always a wonderful opportunity to have time in front of Oregonians. Been doing a lot of that virtually, so it's nice to be here tonight. And thank you for the introduction about my background. I think always good to know, to let people know what I've been doing over the last 15 years as a public servant here in Oregon. I'm running to be your next governor because I believe Oregon deserves a progressive, effective fighter to move our state forward over the next 4 years. I have worked hard in my role as a legislative leader and succeeded in making a real difference for Oregonians, improving the way of life here in our state for the last decade at least. For example, I led the effort to raise the minimum wage, pass a paid family and medical leave program, to make sure every Oregonian has access to health insurance. I supported working women and their families in my time in the legislature, leading the effort to pass paid sick leave, to provide subsidies to make childcare more affordable, and to require equal pay for equal work. When Donald Trump looked to take away access to abortion, I led the effort to pass the strongest reproductive health rights law in the country, ensuring access to abortion. And Oregonians are now protected in their access to reproductive health care, regardless of what the US Supreme Court does. And when Donald Trump tried to attack our immigrant communities here in Oregon, I stood with them and stood up for them and their communities, because we want to have a state where everyone is welcome. Now with challenges like COVID, homelessness, and climate change, Oregon really needs an effective, progressive leader to build a better Oregon for all of us. Because talk isn't enough. What really matters right now is getting results, because we really need that to happen. I know that too many Oregonians are struggling with the cost of housing. That's why I passed the first in the nation rent stabilization law and made historic investments in affordable housing. As governor, I will prioritize helping our houseless neighbors and creating safe, affordable housing for more Oregonians. I also understand how important it is to tackle the climate crisis and protect Oregon's environment for future generations. That's why I helped set Oregon on the path to 100% clean electricity by 2040, passed historic investments in public transportation and zero emission vehicles, and fought for cleaner diesel engines and cleaner fuel standards in Oregon. As governor, I will protect our progress and move us forward to a clean energy future. It really matters who our next government is. This is a really critical election year. Whether it's reproductive rights and abortion or climate change or solving our housing crisis, what you, the voters, decide will either put us on a successful trajectory or pull us backwards to inaction. I will work hard to solve problems with Oregonians in every community so the entire state can thrive. And I hope I can earn your support in the primary, which is coming up in 49 days, and then on in November. It's just a really critical time for our state, and I would very much like your support. So I know you're interested in hearing about my top priorities. I think broadly speaking, where I would start is I want to address challenges by bringing people together and effectively implementing solutions. I can't say this enough. I think experience really matters to be able to know how to bring Oregonians with diverse perspectives into a room to solve problems. It's very important right now that we make sure our state government is efficient, effective, and focused on outcomes that support opportunity and success for every Oregonian. That is my general mission of wanting to be governor, to make sure we can get things done together and make sure our state government achieves what it needs to achieve for every Oregonian. So on top of that, I would say these are my top three priorities, especially as right after I'm elected. First, housing and homelessness. I think addressing homelessness and prioritizing safe and affordable housing for everyone is an absolute must. In the near term, we have to help people get stable and into permanent housing. We have to make sure folks who live on the streets have access to the services they need. We got to get them into housing. We have a humanitarian crisis in our neighborhoods, and that has to change. The longer term solution is making sure we have enough housing. And I don't know if we'll get into that later tonight, but what I can say is we are hundreds of thousands of units short in this state of what we need to get ahead of the demand, make up for the fact that we have a lot of people who still need housing now, and we have people moving to our state. So how we talk about increasing housing in the state is going to be very, very critical. So number one issue for me, number one priority is housing and helping our houseless neighbors. Number two, continuing to expand access to quality healthcare. It's not enough to be insured. You also have to have access to care. So that's a workforce issue for us here in this state, is making sure that geographically diverse areas have access to the care they need. Telehealth has certainly been a big boon there, but we have to do more. And I want to particularly focus on access to mental health care and substance abuse treatment. Even with the passage of Measure 110 and the decriminalization of a minor possession and the direction of marijuana revenue to more treatment services, we have a lot to do to make sure that when someone's ready to, for example, get sober, they're ready to seek treatment. It has to be ready, it has to be available, it has to be, accessible, and people need that, and we don't have that right now. We're on the path to that, and the next governor has to make sure we stay on that. That also includes folks who are seeking mental health care. We have a tremendous workforce issue right now. People aren't able to get the care they need because there's not enough professionals that are available to do the work. So we have to address that as a state. It's especially in the last 2 years of COVID, we have all been through a lot, and even more than ever before, we need access to that type of care. And then, so that's my second priority, making sure we have expanded access to healthcare and mental health and substance abuse treatment as well as a top priority in that bucket. And then the third thing is climate change. We know climate change is happening now. We feel it in the state, from droughts to wildfires to adverse weather events like the very tragic heat wave that we had. It's happening. So we have to do two things. We have to help our communities be more resilient, making sure very vulnerable populations, people who work outside, people who don't have air conditioning, we have to take care of people right now because the weather is changing, the world is changing. I was just in Southern Oregon talking to some farmers about drought. We have to do things differently to address the challenges of our communities. So climate change is about addressing what is happening right now, but it can't be just that. We have to continue to move forward and pushing us towards a clean energy future. We've passed, with my leadership, very important legislation, but we got to carry through on that progress. And that will be a very large priority for me because frankly, we're running out of time and we have to take care of this planet that sustains us. And I look forward to working with all of you to make that happen. So housing and homelessness, quality healthcare, and climate. And I think the last question was to wrap up here in the beginning is you want to know how I'm going to bring our state together. So I'm going to be really honest with you. I think there are a lot of politicians who will make big promises and say, this is the thing that will bring us all together. And the truth is, there is no quick and easy fix for the unity that we need to have as a state. It is going to take determination, and it's going to take all of us pitching in to make that happen. Here's what I would promise on my desire to bring our state together. I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to listen to everybody. And I'm going to spend as much time as possible outside of Salem in every corner of this state to solve problems with people by listening and doing more listening and solving problems. Because until we can focus on things that we do have in common, like our housing issues and our desire to have quality education for our kids or access to healthcare, we need to focus on those things that bring us together and solve problems. Until we do that together, we're not going to, it's going to be hard for us to break down any divisiveness that's out there, whether it's political or geographical. And as Speaker, I've worked really hard to do that. When I was Speaker of the House, I would pair up House Republicans and House Democrats together and say, go visit each other's districts. I did it. I walked the talk. I went and visited my Republican colleagues. They came and visited me in North and Northeast Portland. We need that kind of dialogue and being present in each other's communities to really, if we're going to break down those barriers that are keeping us from solving problems together. And just recently, I mean, the last 4 to 6 weeks, I've been doing as much traveling as I can. I've been to Beaverton, Hood River, Yamhill, McMinnville, Roseburg, Medford, Ashland, Talent, Bend, Salem, Eugene. My list is getting long here, but the goal is to have those conversations in communities around the state. And I'm going to do even more of that in the general election. Because people need, if they're going to hire you, they need to see you. And that's going to be my goal. So I think I'll stop there. I don't know how much time I've taken, but I'm going to throw it back to our moderator and see what's next on your list.
Sure. Well, you talked a lot about affordable housing and homelessness, and that's certainly been a focus in the last couple of years of the Jewish Community Relations Council. So I've got several questions related to that. So what specific steps would you try to take to encourage the development of more housing supply at all levels? And related question, do you feel that the statewide rent control law is helpful in dealing with the housing shortage? And are there parts of our land use policies, such as local inclusionary zoning rules, that can be changed to accommodate the production of more housing?
Well, thank you for the question, Hank. I'm going to start with the last two parts there, because that's related to legislation that I have worked on in my time as Speaker. In 2016, I led the way with a series of bills to deal with the issue of inclusionary zoning. It had been prohibited up until that point. And we worked really hard to craft a bill that said, here are the things you have to look at if you're going to do inclusionary zoning in your community. And I do generally believe conceptually, we need inclusionary zoning. We have to make sure that when new construction is happening, that there is a commitment to affordability in new units. I would say, I think Portland has made it really complicated the way they set it up. And I think we have to make sure it's working. And I think an assessment of how Portland's inclusionary zoning is working, for example. But there are other places who are using it, and I think they're having less issues with it. And so I do think it's important that as we look for new construction, because up until we had that, I think a lot of new construction was happening with no filter of what it means to also have affordable units. And every local community in the state has to be grappling with how you make sure what gets built also serves different incomes. Because as you know, we really love our land use system here. We don't like sprawl. We want to protect our farm and forest. It's really, really important. How we set an urban growth boundary is a very important topic for every community across our state. But embedded in our land use system is, for the wonky people out there, it's goal 10. Goal 10 says, within our land use system, we need to have sufficient amounts of housing for the people who live in our communities. And what's important for me is whatever changes we make, that we're staying true to that goal 10 aspect of our land use system. That's why in 2019, I passed a bill that is, for the first time, requiring much more in-depth analysis about what our housing needs are in each community, what our regional housing needs are, because you could have 5 small towns in the same area, but what's the regional need? Until we know what we numerically need to be building at what income levels, it's very difficult to know where we need to go and to fully achieve the vision of our land use system. So I want to talk about rent stabilization real quick. So also in 2019, I led the way in passing a bill that for rent stabilization. And I know there's been some arguments that somehow is inhibiting new construction, but I gotta say, I think the way it was structured, it's providing stability and predictability for our tenants, which we absolutely need. Renters have to have a sense of what they will be looking at year over year, because until we passed that law, there was incredible rent increases going on across, particularly the metro area, but in other parts of the state as well, that were really injuring renters and inhibiting their ability to stay stable. So what the rent stabilization law said is, year over year, under certain circumstances, you can't increase rent more than 7% plus CPI. In 2022, this year, you can increase rents up to 9.9%. So when I met with landlords to craft that bill, I was told, like, look, if it's 7% plus CPI, if that's the maximum you can raise every year, that is something landlords and property owners can work with. And we exempted new construction for 15 years. If your units are 15 years or younger in terms of their construction status, that doesn't apply. So new construction should not be inhibited by the rent stabilization law. And there are some who argue that we didn't go far enough, that 7% plus CPI is too high. That's what we work together with the landlord community to try to come up with the best way to provide stability and provide some reasonableness in terms of the cost of being a property owner and new construction. So in terms of what I'm going to do as governor, we have to work on our houses, helping our houseless neighbors get housed. So that has got to be a key first step. But let's talk about the supply, because that's what the question was. That is going to be my goal in the very first month of my office. I'm going to put together a group to come up with a 10-year plan to make sure that we can get to the construction we need. We are currently under economic forecast 110,000 units behind. But actually, to meet to make up for the gap, to meet the needs of individuals in the state and the people who are going to move here, we're going to have to build 36,000 units per year for 10 years to get ahead of this. And that's going to take a full, comprehensive approach from the state with everybody getting bought into this. It's going to take a new workforce. It's going to take an examination of how processing for permitting and land use regulations are derived. It's going to take resources. It's going to take stronger private-public partnerships. That is something I'm very anxious to get started on as your new governor, because that is the ultimate solution here if we're going to make sure people have the housing they need.
Thank you, Speaker Kotek. Let's move on to other topics. I'd like to ask you about anti-Semitism. Oregon, unfortunately, has a depressing history of racism and anti-Semitism. Recent data shows that Jews are consistently the most targeted religious community in the United States. Anti-Semitic incidents are being reported at record levels. For example, in 2020, the Anti-Defamation League tabulated over 2,000 anti-Semitic incidents throughout the country, which was the third highest year on record since they began tracking such incidents in 1979. And Jewish institutions are certainly vulnerable targets. Our community has made enormous investments in institutional security in the past few years that seem essential considering the recent history of attacks on houses of worship. In 2020, reported anti-Semitic incidents at Jewish institutions saw an increase of 40% from 2019. So my questions are, first of all, how will you counter terrorism directed against religious minorities? And what safeguards will you advocate for to combat hate directed towards marginalized groups? And what steps will you take to be an ally and partner of the Jewish community around security issues?
And thank you for the question. And as Oregonians, it's important for us to know our history and to make amends and improve. That's why we study the past, right? So we can understand how to be better and do better. Right now, it's important, and as governor, I will do this. It's important to speak out against anti-Semitism, whether it comes from the left or the right. It's completely unacceptable. I think we have to have zero tolerance for anything that smacks of anti-Semitism. We all know the history. And I personally believe that all Oregonians should feel safe in their communities, should be able to be themselves and be who they are and live a life that they want for themselves. And that means keeping people safe. And that means saying no to hate and to violent acts and anything directed particularly at religious minorities, and the Jewish community in particular obviously has a long history there. That's just not acceptable. So as governor, I will stand with the Jewish community to make sure that is dealt with promptly and effectively. I think the long-term solution for hate and intolerance is education. And so I think we should all be proud as Oregonians. And I want to thank the Jewish community for working on passing legislation to require Holocaust and genocide education in Oregon schools. Very important. An educated public at the end of the day is our first line of defense against hatred, the type of hatred that led to what happened in the Holocaust. And so that work in our schools for people who, for our kids is going to be important for the future, right? We have to learn from the past. And I'm just really proud of that curriculum that's now in our schools. I think one of the things that we just recently did in the legislature with the strong leadership of Attorney General Rosenblum was Senate Bill 577, which is the hate crimes law. We, for the first time in 40 years, upgraded that legislation to deal with the situation of growing hate crimes in our state. Now making hate crimes a violent offense based on, if it's directed at someone based on their protected status, making that a felony for the first time, I think is very, very important. We also set up a hotline to make sure we hear about the incidents that are happening, and so we can address them. It is important, although it's distressing at times, but to count and to understand where things are, because you can't address an issue unless you know about it and track it. So I think the hate crimes law is incredibly important. I want to thank the Attorney General for her work. And I also think that we have to add to that. One of the things that I'm interested in pursuing is preventing acts of hatred from turning deadly by saying to people who have been convicted of hate crimes that they don't get to own firearms. We have to be really clear that we want to, prevent future acts and future hatred. And I think keeping people from firearms who have been convicted of hate crimes would certainly help there. In terms of being a partner with the Jewish community, as Speaker, I've had, I think, a very open door policy for all Oregonians to access and become a partner with me and my office about making sure we're standing up for all Oregonians. And that is not going to change as governor, and very much welcome the feedback and friendship and partnership with the Jewish community to make sure that when things happen, that as your governor, I am on top of it. I'm speaking out. I'm making sure you have what you need to feel safe and protected. And I think that's true for communities of color here in the state, or LGBT community, all the communities who feel that they are not, that they are often subject to attack and violence and hatred. I want to be working with you to make sure I stand up for that, stand up against it with you. In terms of security, I know it's been very helpful for the federal government to have their grant program to help religious institutions to upgrade their security. We probably need some state version of that to help and have those resources on hand when things do occur, and to help buildings be upgraded to provide more security. And again, I think it's important to make sure people who are convicted of hate crimes don't have access to firearms. Bottom line is, I will have zero tolerance for hate crimes, anti-Semitism, anytime a community in our state feels unsafe. And I look forward to working with the Jewish community to prevent, and unfortunately, if necessary, intervene, because that's what it means to stand up for every Oregonian. As governor, I plan to do that with you.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about Israel. Our community is very interested in cultivating a strong economic relationship with Israel. Do you think that Oregon could benefit from collaboration with the state of Israel in areas such as water, agriculture, high tech, biotech, and cybersecurity? And if so, what would you do as governor to encourage a formalized partnership with Israel in these areas?
Well, I definitely welcome a increased partnership with Israel. They're a sophisticated, educated state, and very, as you pointed out, in technology and other advances, very important, I think, for us to have that relationship. Because if you think about it, for example, our biggest employer in the state, Intel, has a manufacturing facility in Israel. We're a high-tech state in terms of some of our industries. I think we have a lot in common in that regard. Certainly would want to learn from experts in Israel about water. We are going to have continued issues around drought and other things here in Oregon, even though we have been traditionally a very plentiful state, but we have a lot of challenges. So how do we get that exchange of expertise? And I would very much welcome building that relationship with the state of Israel. Their work on pharmaceuticals and their work around the pandemic has been really helpful to learn about how they've been handling public health issues. So there's just, I think, a really important opportunity for exchange with Israel. And as governor, hopefully would have the opportunity to be part of trade conversations and visits to Israel. As speaker, I had the good fortune of leading a trade mission to China to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Oregon's relationship with Fujian province, our sister province in Oregon, something that began under Governor Vicatia. And what I saw on that trip was those relationships that you develop in those types of trips and those kind of structured partnerships like sister cities and sister provinces, super important, I think, for building international understanding, building relationships, and building the type of economic alliances that I think are going to be important for a place like Oregon, which does have a strong export economy. And so absolutely would want to pursue that.
Thank you. You mentioned climate change as one of your top 3 priorities, and it's also been a very high priority of the Jewish Community Relations Council the last few years. I'm sure you remember the cap and trade efforts that failed in the Senate a couple of years ago that caused the walkout. After which Governor Brown issued the Oregon Climate Action Plan, which sets new greenhouse gas reduction targets and directs state agencies to incorporate climate protections into their agency planning and programs. And subsequently, there's been some opposition from within the business sector. My question is, do you support Governor Brown's Oregon Climate Action Plan? And if not, why not? Or what specifically would you change?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, I do support the efforts that Governor Brown put forward through executive order to set up the Oregon Climate Action Plan. Absolutely essential. In 2019 and 2020, the legislature tried very hard to build a market-driven framework to allow us to move forward in this state comprehensively to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We passed it in the House. I stood on the floor for 6 hours. I remember that debate well. We didn't get it done when the Senate couldn't finish it. And then obviously in 2020, the Republicans walked out. And, there's at least one person we're running for governor who was not at all helpful in this regard and has no interest in advancing the things we need to advance in the state to do our part to address climate change. And so I do support the executive order. I think it's very important for everyone to understand that because it's an executive order, the next governor could completely reverse it. As your governor, I would not reverse OCAP. I think our state agencies and the way we have approached it through that executive order are very critical to continue for us to make progress on our climate goals. There's certainly more we can do. And I'm always open to conversations to make sure it's working well, but we can't reverse it. And I know if Betsy Johnson were governor, I think that would be in jeopardy. I think that would be in jeopardy if we had a Republican. So I think it's very important to know that that is a critical piece of who the next governor will be. And I'm very proud to have the endorsement of the conservation voters in the Democratic primary. I believe I'm the climate champion that we need. And I just want to say thank you for prioritizing this issue at the council. It's so incredibly important that we take care of the planet that sustains us. So thank you. I'm sorry, was there more to that question? I can go on quite a bit on climate.
Well, actually I have another question on climate, which is how would you strike a balance between protecting the climate and protecting jobs when decisions impact both the environment and labor groups?
Yeah, well, we have to be very intentional about it. We all know that the climate is changing and we have to start acting differently, doing things differently, moving us all towards a clean energy future. The way I approach most complex topics, and this is certainly complex and challenging, is it's not an either or conversation in my head. It's always a both and. It's like, we can have both. We can move towards a clean energy future and we can have good jobs, but it is going to take intentionality about how we set up our training programs, what we do as a state to require investments in a certain way. When we passed in the legislature last year, 100% clean electricity, so a clean energy future by 2040 here in the state of Oregon, there was a $50 million investment pot in that bill to help build more in-state community renewable projects. I made sure we had labor standards connected to that pot of money. I think that when you invest public dollars of that size, they should create good jobs. They should create jobs for the future by requiring apprenticeships in certain types of jobs. We have to train a workforce for the future. I think we can do both, but you have to be very serious about it. I stand up for workers. I believe that we all will be successful as a state when we have good paying jobs with benefits. So I don't want to shortchange that. And because we, somehow have to, rush to a cheaper option to get us to a clean energy future, we have to do both. Because if we don't, I think we're not going to be successful. Because if people start losing their jobs and feel like they're going to be left behind, we will not get there. We have to bring people along. That means good jobs, and that means planning for the future.
So we have a question in the chat related to this, which is how will you educate Oregonians about the climate crisis to kind of help bring people along to understand the urgency of the issue? It's just passing bills isn't going to necessarily bring along, the support that's needed.
Well, I totally agree with that. That's one of the reasons I want to be governor. I've enjoyed my time in the legislature. I've been a successful state representative and Speaker of the House, moving very important legislation. But it's not just enough to pass bills. It's not just enough to say, we're going to do this. You have to have a chief cheerleader. You have to have someone who's out in communities going, this is going to be good for our state. How do we do this together? How do we move forward? I do think that, sadly, the things that have impacted our state in the last couple of years, the 2020 Labor Day wildfires, the multiple summers of smoke-filled skies in Southern Oregon. I can tell you, Southern Oregonians, they know this is a problem. They are committed to trying to figure this out. I think when we talk about the heat wave we had and other things that dramatically affected the lives of people in the metro area, people know there's a problem. So the thing is, we have to make sure they understand that we don't want it to get any worse. So we all have to figure out how we're going to change how we live in this world. The good thing is technology is changing. We have more technological options. It will take money. We're getting help for the first time, with the federal government. Some of the things that are coming down the infrastructure package from the Biden administration are going to be super helpful. The next governor needs to make sure we maximize those dollars as well as we can. For example, in producing a cleaner transportation system. That's going to be important. Unfortunately, we lost time under Donald Trump. And we have to make up for that and keep moving forward. So I believe Oregonians are smart. They love their clean air, their clean water. They love their state. And we're just going to have to do more education and awareness of here are the options. Here's how you can be part of the solution. Not doing it to people, but involving everyone to help be part of the solution, because that's how this is going to have to work.
So you mentioned access to healthcare as one of your highest priorities, and you kind of touched on this in your introductory remarks. But I want to talk in a little more detail about the social safety net. So research has shown that the social determinants of health include stable housing, access to food, access to healthcare, which you talked about, and assistance in navigating the healthcare system, which you also talked about. But unfortunately, many low-income folks and particularly minorities and people of color are impacted by the absence of these determinants and have higher levels of illness and mortality as a result. What strategies would you undertake if you were governor to improve those outcomes, especially among minorities and people of color?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, this in general area of interest has been our top priority to me since I came into the legislature. Prior to being in the legislature, I was an advocate, as you mentioned, the Oregon Food Bank and Children First. My job, particularly at Oregon Food Bank 20 years ago, was to talk about why people were coming in for emergency food. And it was cost of housing, medical debt, not making enough, even though they were working 2 or 3 jobs. Income inequality is still a real challenge in Oregon and frankly for the entire country. And I think it's very important to recognize that and continue to support everyday Oregonians to have the basics that they need. I served for several years as the chair of the Human Services Budget Committee in the legislature. I'm very acquainted with what state and federal programs now do. And it's very key that we take as much flexibility and maximize all those dollars, particularly from the federal government. I did a lot of work on SNAP, the former food stamp program, to make sure we could get as many dollars into people's hands so they could go buy food in the grocery store. So going forward, I just want to make sure we keep doing what we've been doing. First of all, we can't take for granted that the things we've put in place will stay there unless the next governor actually is committed to them. For example, making sure our paid family and medical leave insurance program comes online on time and meets the needs of workers. It's so very important that if somebody has to take time off the job to take care of themselves or a new child or an elderly family member, that they can get paid. And we have a really strong program once it's up and running. It's going to be really important for people. I think all of this is also important is workforce development, making sure that all Oregonians have access to good jobs and opportunities. That's removing barriers in our professional development, making sure that that programs are equitable, that there aren't barriers around how much it costs to be in a program to get certification. And we as a state have to walk the talk in terms of how we do our state contracts. What are we requiring from people who are getting public dollars? What are the requirements for promoting more opportunities for women and people of color in the state? We can drive some of that through our state contracting process. And I'm very interested in doing that and very committed to it. And then when people are working and working really hard, we have to make sure that people get paid, that their wages aren't stolen. We have to make sure that the enforcement we have on the books through the Bureau of Labor and Industries or through the Department or through the Attorney General are actually following through. Nothing is more disrespectful to Oregonians when they work hard and play by the rules, and then employers can get away with things that are mistreating them. So there are a lot of things we can do to make a system fairer in Oregon, and I'm very much interested in digging in agency by agency to make sure we make that happen.
So you talked a little bit about substance abuse in your opening comments, and there's a national survey on drug use and health conducted by the Department of Health and Human Services that reveals that Oregon now ranks second in the country for substance abuse disorder, with 18% of the population suffering from addiction to alcohol and or drugs, while Oregon has fallen to 50th in terms of access to treatment for that 18% of Oregonians who need the treatment. What do you envision as the strategic plan to end our addiction crisis?
Yes. My wife's a social worker. We talk about this a lot. It's been very helpful to have a professional in this household, talking with me about not only substance abuse services, but also mental health treatment here in the state. When I see a problem, I look for new ways to fix it. And that's what I will do as your next governor. We, in the 2-year budget that we're now in from the state, last year for this 2-year budget, we said we're going to invest $500 million more into our mental health system. I want to make sure those dollars are being spent well. I am very interested in making sure the Measure 110 dollars roll out in a way that serve people. And I know that might sound a little bit in the weeds, but when we dedicate dollars to something to say we're going to improve our system, that has to happen. But you can't just rely on that money making things happen. You got to have a plan. You have to have the right staff in place. You have to work with your community partners. You have to pay people better. You have to have a workforce you need. All of those things have to happen. And right now, I'm having those conversations now with some of my former colleagues in the legislature to make sure we are ready on day one of 2023 to make sure we're moving forward. I would also say what's going to be important to reduce substance abuse in our state is to get back to a very specific conversation about prevention and education. We have a lot of things we ask our schools to do, but we have to have another conversation. Are we keeping kids from using marijuana? That was part of the deal we made when we legalized recreational adult use. Are we doing enough of that? Drinking, alcohol use in our state is in some ways a bigger problem than any other substance in our state. And what are we doing to keep young people from understanding what it means to drink? And how do we protect them for the future so they can drink responsibly and not abuse it? We have to really have that kind of conversation, as well as we're also dealing with the tail end of the challenge, which is when people need help, they have to have a place to go for recovery. I do think we make it hard in some places for providers to operate. We got to do a better job there. I think some of the things we've done in our Medicaid program for our lowest income Oregonians needs streamlining so people can get more help and not spend all their time, providers spending all their time on paperwork. There are a lot of things we can do to make the system work better. So resources are always important, but it's not just about the resources right now. It's about how the system functions. And we're going to dig into that. And I think there's a lot of good work underway right now. And as governor, I want to make sure that carries through. We have to get people better access to care.
So we're running out of time, and I want to be respectful of your time, but hopefully you can answer one quick question. There are several initiative petitions circulating on the topic of gun violence. One of them, IP-17, involves a permit requirement to purchase a firearm, combined with restrictions on certain types of ammunition in large magazines. Another one, IP-18, restricts the manufacture and sale of semi-automatic and assault weapons. Do you support either or both of these measures, or perhaps other measures to curb the spread of gun violence in our state?
Yeah, I'm glad we're getting this question in. It's an important topic for me, and I want to thank, I think, a lot of people who are watching tonight in the Jewish community who have focused on this topic, so thank you. I have led in the Oregon House to make sure we could get things done. One of the most challenging things in the legislature has been gun violence prevention, making sure that we're doing smart, common sense things when it comes to firearms. And as Speaker, I made sure we did increased background checks for people in private sales and other things like that. That was that loophole. We still have to come back and deal with the Charleston loophole and make sure, I believe personally, that anytime you buy a firearm, you have to pass a background check, no matter how long it takes. We certainly moved forward on safe storage and making sure that people are being asked to store their weapons safely and making sure that if it does get stolen, that it's reported. We also have moved forward saying you can't have guns in certain public buildings. For the first time, the Capitol now has metal detectors and no guns in the building. We have also made sure that if you're, a domestic violence offender or stalking someone, you don't have access to a gun. And we pass extreme risk protection orders to make sure we can reduce the number of people dying from suicide with gun violence. So Oregon has done a lot in the last couple of years, but there's always more to do. I am excited to have a chance to really dig into the ballot measures. I'm glad to see what Washington State has done about restricting high capacity magazines. I certainly don't believe someone under 21 should have access to a semi-automatic military style assault gun, assault rifle. I think we should restrict that. So I can't answer directly to the IPs. I have to go back and look at it. Often I will wait until we have the full language on them, but I will go take a look. But I am committed to working on this. I did it as speaker. I'm going to do it as governor. And I want to work with anyone who has, smart ideas that we can actually get done. And because there's just too many people being hurt by guns right now, we have to do a better job.
Thank you. Well, we have many, many more questions in the chat, but unfortunately, this is all that we have time for. And I know everyone joins me in thanking you for taking the time to chat with us. Thank you as well as Treasurer Reed for both of your dedication to public service on behalf of our state and our communities.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and hope you'll be willing to chat with us again in the not too distant future, maybe even in person.
I would like that tremendously. So thank you for the time tonight. My website's tinafororegon.com, tinafororegon.com. And let us know. There's a way to email me there if you have follow-up questions. And thanks for the time tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And that will end our program for tonight. So again, look for April 18th, the evening of that day for the Republican candidates, and then April 21st. Again, these are not confirmed yet, but April 21st noontime with independent candidate, former Senator Betsy Johnson. Thanks for joining us tonight. We'll see you soon.